Good afternoon and a warm welcome to today's exam webinar about the development of HiL test cases with exam version control. Let me start with the agenda for today. So first off, I want to give you a brief introduction what exam actually is. Then there's going to be a quick explanation what is versioning and version control systems in general. Based on this concept, we're going to show you how this version control is realized in exam. And later on, away from the theory part, we also want to give you a little live demonstration with some impressions of exam version control. Then at the end of this session, we are open for your questions. Let's get started with what is exam. Exam is a test automation solution with an optimized enterprise application, mostly used for the validation of ECUs. But due to its flexibility or extensibility for multiple interfaces, it can be used actually for any automation purposes or test projects. Its approach is model-based for the creation of your tests, and you also have components for the test execution and the evaluation of your test results. exam is itself provided as a freeware solution and has become the standard meanwhile in the VW group and also of all the connected subsidiary companies of VW. Where can you get and require exam? You can find a download section on our website which provides the basic tooling. This means the client and the server, since it's part of a three-tier architecture, also including the exam core library, which is a set of multiple libraries and interfaces to your software and hardware solutions. There are also tutorials and an integrated online help system included in the tool. Regarding the basic tool, you can find three main perspectives for your work with exam. So in order to model and design your test cases, you can use the model perspective. It's the perspective where you can maintain the entire repository of your exam elements. You can also parameterize, modularize your test sequences and compile the tests and make them ready for the test execution. You can also visualize and edit and show up all the different relations between your elements. In the test runner perspective, you have a component where you can actually execute your tests or test suites. You can use this perspective to also monitor and supervise your test runs and to store and recreate your test compilations. In the report manager perspective, this is where you can have a look and examine the results and evaluate those results and compare them later on in this specific perspective. You can also generate nicely formatted reports with the integrated frameworks and also do a result management or check on the real-time measurements that have been recorded inside exam and stored and attached to your report. Now let's transfer these three main components from exam to a more process overview. Right at the left side, or on the left side here, you can see the test specification engineer, which normally provides a test specification that can be implemented with all its test steps to a test designer, and therefore he is using the exam modeler and in a graphical way designing his test cases. Those test cases will then be generated automatically by a server component called the exam generator to runnable Python code. As soon as the runnable Python code is available, somebody like your tester who is in charge for the linkage of your test bench or your HiL platform can then execute the runnable Python code in the exam test runner perspective. And the interesting part at the end is that you can look up and analyze and evaluate your test results in the exam report manager perspective. If you're interested, put below some more QR codes you can scan for further information and also download material on our website. Now let's begin with the actual topic of today's webinar, the exam version control. So what is actually the benefit of exam version control? Let me at first start to give you a brief introduction in general, a quick definition of what a version control system is. So under a version control system, VCS, you understand a system like a repository, which enables you to store and to manage different versions of artifacts in your model or of your software or test development. Such systems typically offer the following functions. Normally, you are always able to recover any state and any element version of this artifact repository. In terms of thinking of concepts to establish parallel developments, you can also branch your current main repository and start up with new development teams branching your current repository. And it's quite typical that you can also create some compilations with interdependent or multiple repositories and group them together to one single product. In terms of baselines or freezing your entire repositories, normally you can also create some labels. Those labels, they also serve for later recovery of such repository states. And in order to prevent any compromisation of the data, you can also be sure and certain that there are some security concepts implemented in version control system tools. Some famous examples are tools like JIT or SVN. So let's have a closer look on EXAM. How did EXAM or how was life in EXAM without version control? So let's pick out some of the text bubbles here on the right side here. One of my favorites is the one like who deleted the wait operation. So if such a thing happened accidentally, the data normally was gone and you had no chance to recreate this data inside your application. If such a situation occurred, you normally had to get in touch with your IT to ask them for a database backup and to recover the entire data. Or something else is like, hello support, please reset the EXAM model to the state of yesterday. This is also something where you have to get in touch with your IT services or your administrator to recreate the model. Or one of those famous backup strategies was like, I want to copy my entire productive test cases to my sandbox just for safety sakes reasons. So working on EXAM without version control was like an open heart surgery. You were working on a living system. And since development and productive test runs were always getting together, it was always a high effort and a risk when you were changing the library, just thinking of new releases where you had to adjust your productive test runs. As I mentioned before, in order to retrieve or request a backup, you had to get in touch with the IT or the administrators of your EXAM infrastructure. Furthermore, it was hard to make changes of elements or entire repositories visible. So it was hardly not possible to figure out which elements have been changed. There was a field called the history next to the descriptions of a test case or of elements, but since this was not part of the data model concept to consistently store this history information, this was only done sporadically, that you could find a history overview about elements that have been changed. And it was nearly impossible to create real development branches when you wanted to start a new test project with a new branch, because the only chance you had was just to copy and paste your current main branch. And thinking of the copying strategy to the sandbox, there was another way how to back up and store your code repository of runnable Python modules by just copying and storing or backing up the entire P-code repository. So with those facts, it was pretty obvious how the requirements to version control should look like for the EXAM model. So this means that version control in EXAM should definitely support the development process, both for tests and libraries. And in order to decouple stable and productive operation on a hill or on a test bench, it should even be possible to evaluate and to further develop functions in EXAM and test cases without any harm or influence to your productive test runs. Another requirement was also to freeze and create releases of your current development states. Just thinking of the end of a software development phase, when you have finished the implementation with your tests you want for a later revision, definitely store and freeze those test states. There is another point of view on why a version control system makes sense, and it's the specifications from a process side. So for the validation process for ECUs, you can always find numerous requirements that make version control for your testing strategy absolutely necessary. Examples are, for instance, to be compliant with automotive standards such as functional safety ISO 26262 or the ASPICE standard, or if there are some compliance to fulfill with your corporate storage periods, or just thinking of being able to reproduce and to recreate any test states. So after all, I think it's crucial that when you have a testing strategy, that versioning is part of this testing strategy, and this makes also versioning in exam mandatory to be compliant with the process specifications. How does it look like? What does EXAM version control offer to you compared to typical version control systems? Of course, in EXAM, you can also log and track any changes to elements in your exam model. You are definitely also able to recover any states for individual objects or for an entire repository. So now it's only, let's say, a few clicks to undo any accidental changes to your model and to recreate these elements. Even to restore any deleted elements can be undone. And the requirement to decouple of current development strains or development versions of your model and elements or test cases that are productively used and stable for the execution on your test bench is also given and fulfilled. Next thing is also a strategy how to archive the individual states of a project. So you can just create baselines, and old versions of those baselines can easily be reused and recreated and executed at any time. So for any regression tests of former or older test cases, you can just switch back to this old version. And one of the standard features is also something that comes with EXAM version control, that you can realize a parallel development and execute your tests based on a separate development branch. Now what we have here is a small illustration regarding the key principles of EXAM version control. On the left side, you see an illustration how version control is realized for the test automation of exam. And on the right side here, you see an example how this is normally done by a version control system like SVN. What you see is the big difference that the EXAM storage concept focuses on a common repository instead of working with local working copies. So what you can see here on the left side is that all group of users, just for instance, the left group of users would be test developers, which are able to change the repository, accessing the latest repository. And on the right-hand side, you have a group of test executors who just rely on stable implemented test cases here and access a latest published repository. Compared to the right side, where each user has checked out his own working copy and is doing his changes locally. And later on, when all the changes are done, they are committing this to a head, like a head latest revision. Whereas on the EXAM side, you have the people working with the latest repository, publishing their things and make it accessible for the test executors, which are accessing the latest published repository. So to focus those key principles a bit more to expressions that are defined for EXAM. So there is a model domain. When I'm speaking of a model domain, this corresponds to a storage location for all the versioned EXAM elements. You can just compare this with a repository in SVN or JIT. Another important object is the model configuration. And I can explain this to you on the graphics on the left side. So a model configuration defines all the available element versions for each model domain. Means instead of model domain, repository. So what we can see here, we have a latest model configuration for the test developers because they can do changes to this latest model configuration. And there is a model configuration for the test executors accessing the latest published model configuration. So here are some expressions about what latest is. With the latest repository, I'm talking about elements that are changeable and in their latest version. Talking of latest published, I mean published and unchangeable latest versions of elements. So whenever you published any elements, you create a new element version. This is comparable and corresponds with a commit action in SVN or JIT. So what you can see here, that this versioning concept perfectly fulfills a decouplement of test development here on the left side and the test execution on the right side. And since you're all working on a common central repository at the same time, and you don't have to check out a local workspace, you don't face any merge conflicts at all because you're used to EXAM, to the soft lock mechanisms that are implemented. Now enough of the theory, and let us just show you a quick live demonstration about EXAM. Therefore, my colleague Tim has prepared, I think, some examples to give you a bit of a deep dive of the functionality. Tim, are you ready to take over? So I would pass the word to my colleague.
Yes, thanks, Rainer.
You're welcome.
And I hope you hear me, and I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, perfect.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to the live demo part of this session here. We will start with a model domain, which we've already learned is one of the key elements of exam version control. We learned that you can think of a model domain just as you would think of a repository in your Subversion or whatever you're using. Plus, model domains are also the starting point in creating branches and baselines. In fact, if you create a model domain, EXAM will automatically create a main branch and the latest published versions for you. So they always exist in every model domain. You can see that here in the square brackets. You see the first text here is the branch. The default branch is always called main, and we're in the latest version of this model domain, which means that we can change elements here. I've already created a couple of elements here in that domain. You can see the small green plus over here. Those indicate that those elements just have been created and as such only exist in the latest version. You can think of that situation that we have here as if you would work with EXAM without versioning activated for your model, or as it was in the past before EXAM 4.6. Whenever I do changes here to those elements, the previous state of the element is gone. If I delete elements, they're just gone, and I have the situations Rainer explained before. So the first thing that we should do here is publish the elements, keep the state to activate versioning. Just select the domain and it will show you all elements that it's going to publish. Then you need to provide a meaningful publish message. We're good to go. As you can see, the green plus signs have vanished, which means that these elements are published, so you can't lose them again. We can also check that in our history view that we introduced with EXAM version control. Here you see all the versions of the element, and here you can see the baselines or versions this is in. So we're currently in the latest version, which has version 1 of this element. And since we published that a while ago, the latest published is also there, and it points to the version 1 of this element as well. So this will change if we now modify it. Just make some simple modifications here and save it. So now, as you might have noticed, this element here gets a small star overlay, which means that it has been changed when comparing it to the version that we published before. So latest and latest published are different. We can double check that here. The latest published still points to version 1, and the latest, which we're on, has got a new version, version 2 of the element. So if I now decide that I don't want this change I just made anymore, so I made a mistake there, or did something just to try it out, and now I want to revert back to the state as it was before, I can just choose discard here. It will show the elements that are selected for the discard, and then I can just say finish. It will bring a warning here that whether I'm absolutely sure to revert that, because what happens now, the version 2 that we had before is gone, and it's gone for good. You have no chance to get it back because it was not published. It was only in the latest, and I've overwritten that with the contents of the version 1. And as you can see now, we have the same state here that we had before. The same holds true if I just delete it and say, oh my God, I didn't want to do that. No problem, just use discard. And it's back again. Another feature is if I delete that element and do publish, it will publish the deletion of this element. So it will be removed from the latest published as well. So now I can't use discard because there are no changes between my latest version I'm on and the latest published version, because I published the delete. But neither, because we have a particular restore deleted function here. So it will scan through the model tree and find versions that have been deleted from the latest published. Since we're on version control, the version is still there, so it's no problem to just restore that. Let's remove all the other elements and just restore that one, and here it is, back again. However, as you can see, it's only in the latest version. To have that under version control again, we need to publish that just as before. So now, yeah, back to work. We're good to go. So let's do some modifications again. And yeah, now we have the state as we had before. We can publish that again. So what you can see here now, I've published my modifications. So the version 2 that we created before by our modification is now also in the latest published version. The version 1 is not contained in any baseline right now or any latest or latest published picker, but it's still there. So what you can do now is, if you think you need something from that version, you could just right click on the version and say, okay, I want to restore that element version, which basically will create a new version, version 3, where all the contents of the version 1 which are restored were copied into. We can just do that and it says hello world again, whereas version 2 should say hello version control. By the way, we can check that. We can open that in a read-only state. So it's implemented for some selected element types and definitely for the sequence diagram. And here on top, you see always the version that you were viewing at. You can't do modifications because it's not in your latest version here, but you can at least have a look at it and see, okay, yeah, that's the version with hello version control here. So that's it for the modification and publishing part. Let's now see how we create baselines. So hello baseline. You would typically create a baseline when you need to have a release of your hard or software that you're testing, and you want to be able to reproduce the tests in its current state. So let's imagine you have written some tests and you executed them and everything is good, and you release your software version or hardware, whatever you're testing, and a couple of weeks later you want to reproduce those tests, probably against a slightly modified version, or to do some integration testing or whatever. Then it's advisable to create a baseline which contains all those elements in the model domain in a fixed version. So yeah, you can compare it to a tag like in Subversion. It's just a named version of your repository that you can restore later, and that you can easily restore without clicking through all those elements and versions. One thing to note is that the baseline, when you create a baseline, it will always include the latest published version of your model domain. So if you want to create a baseline, make sure you have everything published that should be part of the model domain. So let's do that. And now we create a baseline here, a model domain baseline. Need to provide a name and some probably meaningful description here so that you can find that easily again later on. It might take a while, depending on how big or how many data is in here. So what has happened now? We have a version 3, which is in my latest version here, which is also in the latest published because I published most recently. And I have a new baseline here. That's the one I just created, and it's identical to the latest published version right now because it didn't change. So if I do more modifications here, change it back to hello world, you would see we have a new version here which points, which is included in the latest and latest published, and my baseline still remain on version 3, which will change to publish again. Then we'll see that version 4 have latest and latest published here, and the baseline still is on version 3. And this won't change ever because you can't modify a baseline. If you've created it, all elements in it are frozen and will not be changed anymore. So now we've seen how we can do, how we work with elements and version control, but now I created a baseline. So how do I use it? How can I use it and load it and run a test in that baseline version? That's where the model configurations come into play. We have a version perspective here, and here you have all those model configurations that are currently part of the model. Whenever you open a project and connect to an exam model, you need to select a model configuration that you want to load. It will remember it if you like, so that you don't have to choose it every time, but the first time you open the project, you need to select a model configuration. So what is in such a model configuration? Open it here in an editor, and as you can see, it's basically a collection of model domains that you want to see, and each model domain has a version here attached to it. So this is these are library model domains. So I included them in the baseline, which is probably a good idea for stable testing. And here I have my demo domain, which is currently included in the latest. On the right-hand side here, you see all those available versions and baselines that I could use in that model configuration here. So I could just now switch that to baseline and save it. So now I've changed my model configuration, and since this is the one that I am working on, I need to close the project and reopen it again to make the change actually to apply the changes. So now we need to allow some time for the server to load all those required data. Now it's done. As you can see here, here's my demo domain again, and it's still on the main branch, but now I have loaded the baseline I just created. And since it's a baseline, it is read-only, so I can't modify anything in these elements. You just can open them or use them to run tests. This is also indicated as usual by those small log overlay icons here. So there you see that you can't modify anything. But here, yeah, if you open it, you still see the correct version of this element. So if I want to create or want to change things in the baseline, then there's just one option for you that you can possibly do, and that is create a branch. A branch always is created from baseline, so you need to select that domain here in the domain browser. Here we can create a new branch. Just provide a name and some description as well. And as I said before, you need to create a baseline, which is the base from which you branch. So let's use my baseline here. And when you finish that, you can also see here, if you select the domain, you see in the versions view up here, now we not only have the main branch as before, but also the branch I just created. A new branch will always have a latest and latest published, so that you can use that in your model configuration to actually work on the branch. So let's do that again. Let's switch to the latest version of that new branch. As before, we need to close the project and open it again to apply the changes I just made. By the way, you can also switch the current model configuration. Just press the select button here and you see all those configurations that exist. And if you select one here, EXAM will close and reopen the project automatically. So then there's no need for manual interaction. So now, as you can see, I am on my branch and in the latest version. So I'm able to modify that element again. So let's just save that. And it behaves just like I've shown you before. And we can see that in this review as well. We now have a latest version here and also the latest published, which is an older version of this element here because I modified it. You can also see the baseline that you were branching from here in this view. On the top right, you can switch between all those branches. So here we see what we've seen before, and now I'm more interested in my branch. So we can do this here as well. You can just do anything that we could do before on your branch, just like if you were on the main branch. So if you publish it, see the latest published is now the same version as the latest, and the baseline is still there. So I hope you enjoyed it. That's from my side, and back to Rainer.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So thank you again, Tim, for this nice live demonstration. This was giving us a really good overview about all those features of EXAM version control. To continue and to also conclude today's webinar, I've brought to you an overview about all the features and about, let's say, the picture of how to work with EXAM with and without versioning. So what you can see here is a list of all the important major features of EXAM. And in the middle column, you can see those features that are part of the basic freeware version of EXAM. So starting again, or thinking back again to the three main perspectives I've shown you before in the introduction, there are features for designing the test cases, for running and executing the test suites, doing the evaluation of the test reports, and also managing the model configurations in order to load your model. So those are all features that are part of the freeware distribution of EXAM, of the core tool. And there is another enhanced version of EXAM, which includes the feature of EXAM version control. And this also integrates all those features that are listed below the creation of the model configuration, such as dealing and handling of versioned EXAM elements, creating baselines, branches, and even restoring model elements and the other typical versioning features that you have seen before. Okay, now, hopefully we were giving you, let's say, a nice overview about the benefits and the functionality of EXAM version control, and would also allow us to share some supplementary information and documentation that is provided inside the tooling itself. If you download our application, you can find this in the integrated help system, also for the features and functionalities for the different editors and views that are, let's say, related to EXAM version control. And there is also additional info material on our website. But nevertheless, you can always get in touch with us if you need any advice on usage of EXAM version control, or when you want to transform from a non-versioned EXAM model to a versioned EXAM model. You can also shoot an email to us or just call us if you want to request any demo licenses for your evaluation of EXAM version control. There is another QR code that you can scan for additional information. So now we would be really looking forward to support you in your start with EXAM version control, and hopefully this was, let's say, a convincing introduction that versioning is a mandatory feature for your testing strategy. So thank you very much until now for your attention and your participation, and now we would be open for your questions. You can just unmute your microphone or you can post them in the chat. We are also willing to answer your questions even in German language if it's easier for you, and just let us know. Thank you.